your prospect is confused. So they'll say something like, oh, we've already got a solution for that. But when they describe their solution, it's actually like not what you do at all. There's a saying in sales where like when you're explaining, you're losing. And one of the worst things you can do in this scenario is be like, hey, hold on, no, like here's how we're different. Because the moment you do that, they're like, this person's trying to pitch me, and they're already like 1 foot out the door. Instead, what you need to do is you actually need to like, what's going on, folks? Good friend of mine who runs a pretty big sales team, lots of SDRs, said that the team was struggling with this one objection that actually sounds kind of weird, but it comes up really often in sales. I'll call it your prospect is confused. So they'll say something like, oh, we've already got a solution for that. But when they describe their solution, it's actually like not what you do at all. I'll give an example. Like if you were selling SoulCycle classes, it would be like if someone was like, I've got a gym membership. It's like, yeah, like that kind of works. I guess if you had like a gym membership that had fitness classes, that would be an objection. But it's like, that's not exactly what SoulCycle does. SoulCycle and a gym membership can actually coexist, and they usually do. There's a saying in sales where like when you're explaining, you're losing. And one of the worst things you can do in this scenario is be like, hey, hold on, no, like here's how we're different. Because the moment you do that, they're like, this person's trying to pitch me, and they're already like 1 foot out the door. Instead, what you need to do is you actually need to like play dead and agree with the objection and be like, I totally get it. You got that thing taken care of. And then you need to ask them a question that gets them to realize it on their own terms that you're different. And that's when you can go on and explain or educate. And folks, I'm gonna be like whiteboarding a lot of this stuff out. And so I definitely recommend like watching this on YouTube if you aren't already. So let's dive in. So we'll handle this one in 3 steps using what I call the Mr. Miyagi method to handle any objection. If you haven't heard it before, we've talked about it a lot on this channel and in our book, but the 3 steps are you need to, 1, agree with the objection, which is the wax on. You don't try to like counter the punch right away with another punch. You need to redirect the momentum of the punch, or the objection in this case, by agreeing with it. So when you agree with an objection, usually a prospect's like, oh, like this guy's not gonna try to like pitch here. And all of a sudden, like this pressure of the sale is released where they open their mind again. They're actually like listening to you. And that's what allows you to ask them a question. And that's what we call incentivize conversation. In other words, I'm going to say something like, hey, just so no one from my team calls you again, could you tell me about this? And that question is what usually exposes more information about the objection because you don't have enough information to handle it, or it gets like the prospect to realize something on their own terms. All right, so that's step 2. And then once they're like, we don't do that, or like that does sort of suck, that's when you don't come in with the pressure pitch. You don't try to sell the product. You don't try to sell the car. You sell the test drive. In other words, you're like, hey, are you like open to taking a look at this thing, not for now, but for later? Like, don't try to pitch. The moment you pitch on a cold call, you reapply the pressure, and that's when your prospects run away. The goal is to like get them to sit in the car. So we'll call this the confused objection. Let's run this through these 3 steps, okay? So I used to sell compensation software at a company called Paybook. I was VP of sales there, led them from 0 to 10 million an hour in 18 months, and we would run into this objection all the time. What would happen is most companies have some sort of like HR platform. If you've ever been paid by a company, you probably got paid on like Gusto or Rippling or JustWorks or Workday. Wherever you were getting your pay stubs was where like their HRIS platform was. The vast majority of HRIS platforms do not handle compensation planning, which is what Pave does. So Pave basically says, hey, I'm gonna take all your employees and all of your performance ratings and like market data based on like the average rate for a software engineer. I'm gonna say like based on the performance of this engineer and where they are relative to market, like here's what comp increase you should give them. And most companies do this in spreadsheets with like a million different like VLOOKUPs and macros, and then they just like plug the results into their HRIS. So a lot of times people would confuse it because they'd be like, no, we run payroll with Gusto, or they'll like think we're a payroll provider because we're talking about compensation, and that wasn't true. So step 1 is I've actually got to agree with the objection, because I can't just explain or pitch Pave on why it's different because they're already resisting on a cold call. Remember, this is like the first reaction, okay? So agreeing with the objection, let's say that they're on Gusto. It might say like, hey, Jane, totally get it. Like, honestly, I should have assumed that your team had this totally taken care of with Gusto. Like, it seems like you run a pretty tight ship. That's step 1. Jane's like, okay, is like not gonna pitch me. I guess we can go now. And now I'm gonna say, hey, step 2, incentivize. Just so no one from my team calls you again. That must mean that you're not doing any like performance-based comp increases, right? Where it's like you've got a merit matrix where if someone has like a performance rating of a 3 and they're below market, like they get a 5% increase versus a performance rating of a 4 and above market, then they get like a 6% increase. You're not doing like anything like that. It's probably just like straight flat comp increases. And they'll usually be like, no, we are doing that. Like we do that on spreadsheets and we plug it into Gusto. And that's when they come to the answer on their own. They're like, oh, like, is that what you do? And that's where I'm gonna match their O with like my O. I'm gonna be like, oh, yeah, like honestly, I was a little bit confused when you said you do this thing on Gusto because I imagined you wouldn't be doing like flat increases anymore. Yeah, so like the way this thing works is like now I can start to like explain oranges versus apples, right? We'll call this OJ versus apples. And I can be like, we never replace Gusto. Like usually like that process in spreadsheets is like a huge pain. And Pave essentially takes care of like all that stuff that you're doing with like the macros and the VLOOKUPs and like pulling in your comp bands. We handle all that. My guess is you're probably not gonna buy this thing anyway. Got a pretty good process with Gusto. Maybe you're a master of VLOOKUPs or whatever, but like, are you open to taking a look at this thing just so you know it's out there and you can see how they sort of play together? So like, notice I'm like explaining the difference. I'm saying like, yeah, all that stuff you're doing on spreadsheets, it usually sucks. And we do this at Pave instead. And then one of two things will happen when you actually get them to understand what you do. So you go from confused to they'll either be like, oh yeah, that spreadsheet thing sort of sucks. And at which point you're like, okay, cool. Like I'll book the meeting because spreadsheets suck. And then from there, you can go and like sell them on why you're better than spreadsheets. It's pretty straightforward. Other answer is they'll be like, no, like the spreadsheets are actually like pretty good. They like their spreadsheets, okay? And so now this actually brings us into a competitor objection. So when you go through like a confused objection, one of two things happen. You clarify the difference and they're like, oh no, what you actually do is a priority for me, at which point you book the meeting. Or they're like, oh, now I get it, but yeah, that's not really a problem. Like we do this through this other competitor or this other solution. And now guess what? That's when you run Miyagi again. So let's like treat spreadsheets like a competitor here, even though it's sort of like an in-house solution. You handle them the same way. They're basically like doing something that you do a different way. So we'll go through these 3 steps again. You're gonna agree with the objection as step 1, okay? So when you're agreeing with the objection, I'm gonna say the same exact thing and be like, honestly, I said it before, my guess is your team is probably pretty good on spreadsheets. Like I saw the comp analyst that you hired, like she's awesome. She worked at Expedia and like probably had to do this at the scale of like millions of people and you've got like 500 people, so you're good to go. It's like, oh, okay, the seller gets it, yada, yada, yada. Remove the pressure of the sale. From there, I'm gonna incentivize conversation, okay? And notice, I'm gonna ask a different trap question. I need to ask a question that is, what is the thing that I do that I know spreadsheets don't do? What's the thing that we do that I know Gusto doesn't do? I know Gusto or your HR platform won't handle like performance-based comp increases. So I was like, hey, you must not be doing performance-based comp increases, right? Now I'm gonna run that same play, but with spreadsheets. And so I know spreadsheets are good for like pretty simple comp increases, but I know that spreadsheets make it really hard to do equity comp. And the reason for that is when people are getting stock option bonuses, a lot of times their bonuses are based on how much equity they have. But the value of their equity is determined based on like when they started at the company. If they started early stages, they might be like a millionaire on paper and like their equity bonus is gonna be like pretty minuscule relative to the equity that they already have, versus if they just started last week, their equity isn't worth very much. So you need to like take into account all of the equity they have when you're considering how much of a comp increase I'm gonna give them. But the problem is HR people don't even have access to all of that data. Pave does because it integrates with the systems of the CFO too. And so I know that if they're planning equity in spreadsheets, they're probably like heckling their CFO or like they have this janky workaround process. So I'm just gonna ask him like, just so no one from my team calls you again, like I know I'm really pushing it here, but like you probably aren't doing like stock option based bonuses or anything like that. Are you just doing like cash based comp increases? 9 times out of 10, I knew I was calling venture backed companies that were doing that. And they'd be like, no, we are. That's also in our spreadsheets, or our CFO handles it. And that's when I can sell the test drive. And I'm like, so like, I totally get this. Honestly, again, you're probably not gonna buy this thing, but like now I can educate them on the difference. I can be like, usually when managers can't see cash and equity all together in one place, like they'll oftentimes like give people a bigger cash bonus because they don't realize like how much this person's like making out on their stock options. Pave helps you like plan all that stuff all together in one place without you having to like heckle your CFO. I know I pushed my limit here. There are a lot of companies like y'all who have worked with us in the past, and like, are you open to taking a look at this thing just so you know it's out there? And then if it's not a fit, like you're a little bit more informed for your next comp cycle. And 9 times out of 10 at that point, if you handle the second objection, that's usually when you get the meeting, right? So you go from like confused to competitor. And if you handle 2 objections, you'll usually get through it. If you get a 3rd objection at that point, like you might get the meeting, but I usually find that like once you get in like 3 or 4, like the person's just like, they're coming up with anything. And at this point, they're either gonna hang up or like they're actually just like not open to meeting with you. And at which point you can move on. To recap, we talked about the confused objection, where you agree with the objection. You say, hey, totally get it. You're using Gusto. I should have assumed you had this unlocked. You incentivize conversation that pokes a hole, that gets them to realize the confusion on their own terms. You're like, hey, you must not be using performance-based compensation where you have to do this, this, and this. It really sucks. It's confusing. You probably don't have to do that in Gusto, right? They're like, no, we do. It's in spreadsheets and it sort of sucks. You sell the test drive. You're like, oh yeah, here's what we do versus Gusto. Are you open to taking a look? They say, yes, spreadsheets suck. Cool, book the meeting. They say, no, I like my spreadsheets. This really isn't a problem. At which point you go then handle the spreadsheet competitive objection with the same 3 steps: agree, incentivize, test drive. So folks, if you like this one, I've got 2 things for you. Number 1, we broke down 18 objection talk tracks and wrote out the scripts for every single one of them. I'll put a link to that toolkit here in the show notes, or it'll pop up somewhere here. It's literally free. Go download all those talk tracks. The confused one is actually not in there, so this is new. And then step number 2 is our course is like the ultimate step-by-step guide on how to win on the cold call, from opener through objection through like how you plan your day. The entire section 2, which is like 3 or 4 videos, is nothing but objections. It goes through the full Mr. Miyagi approach, like multiple examples by industry, the tone you should be using for every single objection, plus it goes through like all of the talk tracks so you can really get the stuff down. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And folks, if you like this one, it would mean a ton to me. We're trying to grow this channel. If you liked, subscribed, and then told me what you wanted to see next in terms of an objection down below. It's the #1 way you can tell the algorithm that you like this type of content, and that's what allows us to keep doing this stuff. Alrighty folks, catch you soon.